Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about the incredible story of New Orleans, 20 years after Hurricane Katrina. We're going to look at the absolute devastation, the amazing rebuilding effort, and some of the really tough questions the city is still wrestling with today. You know, to really get this story, you have to start with the people. And this quote from Bernell Catlin, who lives in the lower Ninth Ward, it just says it all, doesn't it? This wasn't just about broken buildings. It was about communities being ripped apart, neighbor by neighbor. The scale of what happened in August 2005 is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Over 1,800 people lost their lives when the levees failed, and 80% of the city went underwater. Just an unbelievable human cost. And the financial cost? Well, that was just as staggering. We're talking more than $200 billion in damages. That makes Katrina the single costliest disaster in American history. A major American city was essentially wiped off the map. So, in the middle of all that destruction, the people of New Orleans were faced with this massive, fundamental choice. A choice that would really define the next 20 years of their lives.
Let's look at this choice through one story, the story of Antoine's restaurant. This place is an institution, been around since 1840. The owner, Rick Blount, comes back to the city and finds his family's legacy, a building that survived the Civil War, looking like it could just fall down at any second.
And this right here, this quote gets to the absolute core of the decision so many people made. For Rick Blount, just walking away, it wasn't even a consideration. It wasn't about the money. He felt it was his duty, his responsibility to the city, to its history, to bring it back. So let me ask you this. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. Your home is gone. Your business is destroyed. Your entire neighborhood is underwater. What do? Do you cut your losses and just start over somewhere else? Or do you stay and fight for the city you love? That was the question. So they chose to fight. They chose to rebuild. But how on earth do you even start to bring back a drowned city? The task was just monumental. Well, the answer is it wasn't just one thing. It happened on two fronts at the exact same time. You had this huge top-down effort, right? $120 billion in federal aid flowing in, special commissions being set up. But what was just as important was the bottom-up grit. Everyday people like Rick Blount, housing his staff on ships, hiring his own displaced workers to do the demolition, relying on local Creole craftsmen to literally save the historic buildings. It was this incredible mix of federal power and pure individual resilience. Now, a massive chunk of that federal money, we're talking almost $15 billion, went into making sure this could never, ever happen again. And the result? New Orleans now has the best protected levee system in the entire country. But this is where the story gets a lot more complicated. Yes, the city came back. But that recovery, well, it wasn't a tide that lifted all boats equally. Not by a long shot. You know, from a distance, if you're standing in the French Quarter today, you might think, wow, New Orleans is totally back on its feet. But the moment you start to actually look at the data, a much more complicated and, frankly, troubling picture starts to emerge. For starters, not everybody came back. The population of the metro area is still about 7% smaller than it was before the storm. That's a huge, permanent loss of people. And nowhere is that loss felt more than in the lower Ninth Ward. This was a historically black neighborhood, lots of homeowners. It's where the levees broke with the most force, literally pushing houses off their foundations. It's heartbreaking, but today, only about a third of the people who live there have been able to come home. And the economic recovery? Just as unequal. The wealth gap is absolutely stark. Right now, the average white household in the New Orleans metro has 10 times the wealth of the average black household. It just goes to show you that while parts of the city were being rebuilt, some of those deep, long-standing inequalities, they stayed right where they were. And in some ways, they actually got worse. And this brings us right back to Bernell Catlin. He saw that no big grocery chains were coming back to his neighborhood. So he took his life savings and opened the only grocery store in the lower Ninth Ward. He literally started by selling milk and bread out of a little window. He even lets his neighbors run a tab if they're short on cash. His story is it's the perfect example of that incredible community spirit and the huge ongoing challenges that people are facing. So what's next? What does the future look like? Well, the city isn't just trying to get back to the way things were. The goal now is to forge a completely new future, one that's more resilient and hopefully more equal. But they are facing some serious economic headwinds. The whole metro area has 10% fewer jobs than it did before Katrina. The economy is still really dependent on old industries like oil and gas and shipping, and those industries are all replacing people with automation. And tourism, which is the #1 driver, it just pays really low wages. It makes it hard for people to get ahead. But out of the storm, something truly radical happened. One of the biggest experiments in American public policy, actually. The city's failing public school system was completely torn down. And in its place, they built a new system from scratch, all based on giving schools autonomy and giving parents a choice. Basically, schools get their funding based on whether or not they can attract students. So, did it work? Well, the results have been pretty remarkable. The New Orleans school system went from being one of the worst in the entire country to somewhere in the middle of the pack. We're talking double-digit gains in reading and math scores. That is a huge, huge leap forward. And that improvement in education, that's one of the key ingredients for building a whole new economy. You're seeing an entrepreneurial boom. The city is tapping into its 9 universities to create a knowledge-based workforce. They're growing that amazing creative economy of musicians and artists, and they're investing in startups in cutting-edge fields like biotech and carbon capture. So look, the last 20 years have proven one thing beyond any doubt. The people of New Orleans are incredibly resilient. They did the impossible. They rebuilt a city. But the next 20 years, well, that's when we'll find out the answer to an even bigger question. Can they build a city that's not just resilient, but one that is truly equal and prosperous for every single person who calls it home? The work, as you can see, is far from over.